Thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be here. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm a general pediatrician and have been for a long time. And long before there was a term of social pediatrics, like many of the people in this room, I was devoted to it without knowing it. And much of my career, and it's been a long career, and I've been very, very lucky, has been devoted to environmental issues as they impact children. And largely, I began with lead poisoning. The first child whose mother I told died of lead poisoning when I was an intern. So it's been lead and secondhand smoke, and from secondhand smoke to alternative tobacco products. Nick is leading an effort. I believe you're leading the effort on commercial influences on child health. The truth is that many, if not most, of the non-communicable diseases of children and of adults are a consequence of commercial interests. And tobacco often is thought of as an adult disease, and it's not an adult disease in any way. We focus on the adult consequences of something that almost always begins during childhood. And one of the most evil empires that I could think of is the tobacco industry. So, tobacco is the leading preventable cause of death in the world. More people die of tobacco-related deaths each year than of malaria, TB, and HIV combined. It's estimated that 1 billion people will die this century alone. And it's been resurrected. We've made great progress, at least in some of the high-income countries, in decreasing tobacco use or smoking of cigarettes, which is entirely man-made and is only about 125 years old, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I have no conflicts of interest to acknowledge to you, and I would if I had some. But people now focus on obesity, but tobacco still continues to take more lives and have as much or more morbidity associated with it as obesity. We've already covered that. And why would we speak about smoking and vaping as pediatric diseases? Both smoking and electronic cigarette use. I don't know about hookah. The data are not there about age of onset of hookah in any national data sets that I'm aware of. But both smoking and e-cigarette use begins in childhood or adolescence. And if this were a different talk, we could spend 3, 4, 5, 6 hours talking about the effects of prenatal exposure and secondhand exposure. So if you've grown up in a household, about 20% of people in the United States who die of lung cancer never smoked a cigarette, but grew up in a household with smokers. We now have some data, depends on how long-winded I am, whether I get to show it to you or not, about inflammatory changes in children who grow up in households with people who vape. There are data that's been published on hookahs. But the average age in Europe and in the United States of beginning to smoke cigarettes is 11 to 12. So this is very much a pediatric issue. Preterm labor, increased rates of death from meningococcus, RSV, increased rates and severity of asthma, changes in the oral microbiome and periodontal disease, and death later on from COPD or lung disease. So I'm going through these quickly because I want to get to the alternative tobacco products, but they're alternative because of our successes with cigarettes. But you could see that in much of the world, it's still 20 to 35% of people smoke. And it varies very much nation to nation. But there are changes. Again, if we had time, I would show you changes over the past decade, because as smoking goes down in high income countries, the tobacco industry has been targeting lots of low resource countries in ways in which they seduced young men 100 years ago during World War I by free gifts. If you're prenatally exposed or exposed in your first 2 years of life, it may take only 2 cigarettes to be addicted for the rest of your life. And it appears that nicotine is the single most addictive substance that people are exposed to. Mark Twain, a great humorist and I would say philosopher from the United States, said that quitting smoking was the easiest thing that he ever did. He did it every day of his life. Um, so, 2 cigarettes. So, for those of you who take care of adolescents or who have raised children, a couple of drinks in a college dorm and somebody has a pack of cigarettes and you were prenatally exposed, or you grew up in a family such as the one that I grew up in, where 5 different families ate dinner together and all the adults smoked during dinner. So it's very hard not to become a smoker. The other thing is that the pleasure pathways associated with smoking cigarettes, or nicotine, I should say, are the same pleasure pathways that are activated by eating a fat laden meal or by sexual arousal. So there are different pleasure pathways and nicotine. So an interesting aside, however, is that the density of nicotine receptors, which are the density portends how easily you'll become addicted, is much greater depending upon how much exposure you have prenatally in the first several years of life. But you have literally billions of nicotine receptors in your brain. So nicotine clearly had some role because in biology there is nothing that exists for without a purpose. So this slide, let me see if I can figure out how to. Not sure. I just want to let me look at this. So the orange slide is cigarettes, and this is amongst high school students in the United States. The United States is very privileged in many ways. I don't know how long those privileges will last, but it has about 2 dozen nationally representative surveys that one can study. Only a couple are longitudinal, most of them are cross-sectional. Only 2 of them have biologic measures. The National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey does. But there is a youth tobacco survey that's fielded by CDC. We may have a new director of CDC or Health and Human Services who doesn't believe in vaccines. Um, so, but I digress. But I want to show you the decline amongst adolescents in orange in smoking cigarettes. And the blue is this epidemic of e-cigarette use. These data only go up to 2022. I have more recent data on a subsequent slide, but I just want to show you before COVID, people became very, very alarmed both because of hookahs and e-cigarette uptake. And the same game book that was used to seduce men and women to use cigarettes 100 years ago is very effectively working with adolescents, young adolescents. I loved your slide on adolescent cognition and decision making. I thought you hit spot on all the points that I could think of that people have studied with tobacco uptake. So we could, if I had my way, I would spend the rest of the day with you talking about this slide. So as you could see in 1900, almost nobody in the United States smoked a cigarette. All right. And you could see, and I so wish, can somebody from IT help me with this? It's in the middle. No? Ah, okay. There we go. I sorry. Got it. Okay, I'm going to look at this rather than turn my back to you. So 1914, you have the First World War. It's the late 19th century that two things happen. Tobacco goes back ancient times, but cigarette as an epidemic, the CDC, by the way, the Centers for Disease Control, says it lists the 10 greatest epidemics of the 20th century and the 10 greatest public health success stories. And two of the 10 are pediatrics, and they're lead poisoning and tobacco. Um, so in the late 19th century, Koch discovers the TB bacillus. And if you read the American Journal of Public Health or the New England Journal of Medicine or the New York Times from the late 19th century, you would see that state by state there were lawsuits trying to determine whether or not you could restrict spitting in public. All right, because of the discovery of the TB bacillus. And spitting was a big habit, and people chewed tobacco, and you no longer could chew tobacco. And in 1894 is the first commercial development of a machine that could mass produce cigarettes. And young men were targeted initially, and you could see, oh, I so apologize to you. You could see this remarkable increase so that by the 1960s, almost half the population of the United States smoked cigarettes. And tobacco, by the way, has a great contribution to the people in this room and what you're devoted to public health, because epidemiology grows out of efforts to nail what physicians rather were recognizing starting around the 1930s, which was an epidemic of a disease that had not been seen before called lung cancer. And so it's an accident of World War II. This is a great slide, and this is a great horrible story about social determinants of children's disease. It's not thought of as glamorous anymore because we've heard about it so often, but it's the United States at the end of World War II decided to put together a healthcare insurance system that's employer-based, as opposed to England, where people have a national health service. So as I understand it, two people named Richard Dahl and Sir Bradford Hill designed not just case studies, but epidemiologic studies that looked at registries of physicians, because every physician had to fill out a questionnaire each year, and they linked them to death certificates and found out that it was physicians who smoked who were dying of lung cancer. All right. So I do want to you to see in orange, we've played a remarkable role, we being pediatricians, in dealing with this epidemic. So we did the very first studies, and we're responsible for the majority of studies about tobacco, and children at least. And then my mentor, Julie Richmond, who started something called Head Start, testified, was the medical expert witness in the first class action suit to be won against the tobacco industry, leading to FAMRE, which created the Truth Campaign. So the pictures that I mentioned to you, evidence-based studies of what would turn kids off versus turn them on, because the best health services research, I believe, that's behavior related is done in Hollywood and on Madison Avenue. Everything that you see on TV, those ads are beta tested, is what it's called. There's a reason why there's an Apple computer in every scene of a Netflix movie, right? It's not by accident that it's there. There's lots of money that's changing hands, lots of money. And nobody has more money than the tobacco industry. Nobody. I don't think that there's a single industry, and they've now bought a lot of the fast food. When you walk down the cereal aisles and the candy aisles, it's Philip Morris that owns that, because they were worried until they developed e-cigarettes that they were going to lose the tobacco market. Um, and then we have what's called the master settlement, which gives the regulatory basis in the United States for regulating tobacco products. I've been privileged to be on the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration's Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee, which Philip Morris has now gotten around by creating synthetic nicotine. So if you make nicotine in the laboratory, it's not naturally grown, so it's not the purview of the FDA to regulate that. So many e-cigarettes, how many flavors are there of e-cigarettes? Do you know? Anybody want to take a guess? 15,000. Yeah. And how many applications for new e-cigarette products are at the FDA now to be reviewed by the Scientific Advisory Committee? There's a reason why I don't volunteer in those early morning meetings. There are over 2 million applications that have been submitted, each of them between 100,000 and 1 million pages. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? You want to overwhelm the system that's put in place. Right. There's no way that you could possibly review all of that. But you can see an equally steep or almost as steep decline in smoking in the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. So as the cigarette market went down, the tobacco industry came up with a number of other forms of to consume tobacco. So e-cigarettes, which look nothing like the picture that you see here, that's what the original generation. There have been well over 10 generations now of e-cigarettes. I'll show you a picture of something I'm not, you can already tell that I'm not very technologically adept and I'm not drawn to machines, but there is a new product that's been created that when it was passed around the room at the last Scientific Advisory Committee meeting, I could not let go of. It was so beautiful and it was so sleek, and I'll show it to you. And I do believe there are a number of European countries that have allowed it on the market. But you have snus and variations of it that adolescents chew or put between their cheek and their gums. When I was a kid, I used to I used to chew black licorice because I loved baseball, and baseball players were paid to have chewing tobacco and to spit on TV. And so as a little boy, I was primed to emulate them and keep a big wad of licorice, as all the kids in my neighborhood, including Anthony Fauci, who grew up just several blocks away playing baseball on the same field that I did. But this is a worldwide epidemic, and some are indigenous to particular nations. So BDs, for example, come from South Asia. And a cigarette simply is something, a tobacco delivery mechanism or a nicotine delivery mechanism that's covered with paper. And there are 7 different species of plants that have nicotine in them, including eggplant. So we did studies, I'll show you the data of them, of hookahs and the air quality and carcinogens in the room. And as a consequence, New York City, by the way, I don't see myself as a researcher. I see myself as a child advocate. And it was interesting taking the mentees who worked on this with me to meet with the city council to present our data, which led to regulations of hookah bars. But the lawyers for the hookah bars insisted that the nicotine that we found in the air didn't come from the hookahs, but that some of the patrons probably ate eggplant before they went there, because eggplant contains. Yes. A kretek comes from Indonesia, and it's a clove form. That picture of a little one smoking what looked like a cigarette was smoking a kretek from Indonesia, right? So that does not contain nicotine. So there are a whole bunch of things that have been created, not all of which have nicotine. In fact, e-cigarettes they are currently the major way in which marijuana is used in the United States. Um, and fortunately, it's now regulated, except it's much more expensive, the regulated version versus what's bought on the street, which is now being cut with fentanyl. Right. And I haven't mentioned it yet, but some people do believe that nicotine is not but the gateway drug. So if you're prenatally exposed or secondhand smoke exposed or smoke cigarettes, it's substantially easier to become addicted to cocaine or heroin. You have to use a lot more heroin or cocaine to become addicted if you aren't already addicted to nicotine. But it's not just nicotine that these products are now being used for. So this shows you the take off. I do believe I have a slide that e-cigarettes start around 2009. One good thing about the COVID epidemic and kids staying at home is that there's been a precipitous decline in use of e-cigarettes. If you can't go out and you're hanging out with your parents, it's harder to start if you're 11 or 12. Um, but you could see in red the e-cigarettes taking off. So this is past 30 days. There are people who get PhDs on how you measure the amount of addiction that one has to nicotine. So there are scales that you can use. There's one single question that you can ask that really works well, which is how long is it after you awake before you take your first cigarette or use an e-cigarette first? I used to be a marathoner and a 2-pack a day smoker at the same time. And I tried every day to stop smoking. And I was on vacation on an island off of Massachusetts. And I was bathing my daughters, who were very young at that point. And I was sitting in the bathroom smoking a cigarette. And my wife walked in and said, "You know, you're a hypocrite, don't you?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "You're getting famous and we're doing well financially because of what you're discovering. And you claim to love these little girls more than anything you love. And you're poisoning them with the very poison that you're documenting is a poison." And I never smoked a cigarette again after trying to stop. It's a very fascinating addiction. But for people who are addicted, time to first use, but 30 days is the usual measure in a national survey of being a current user. If you've used in the last year, it means that you are an ever user. That's a very crude measure, the past 30 days, but you could see that 30% in 2019, right before COVID, 30% of kids were using e-cigarettes. And kids who have used e-cigarettes in the past 30 days, a quarter of those kids are daily users. So that would be a more granular way of looking at it. You'd want to know how often you use it. You were interested in hookahs. People will use hookahs for hours on end, but it's a social activity that people do once a week or once a month. So although the concentration, because one hour session on a hookah is the equivalent in terms of exposure to a number of carcinogens. You ready for this? One hour session is about 100 cigarettes. And a number of papers from South Asia have shown that it's a very efficient system for transmitting tuberculosis. And I spend a lot of time in Abu Dhabi, and you could see people spend the whole afternoon sharing a hookah, 4 or 5 people. So we've studied changes in the oral microbiome. So if I spent 4 or 5 hours breathing your air and you breathing mine, we would change our oral microbiomes. And we've even looked at periodontal changes in microbiome with hookah use. So this is the machine that I was talking about not wanting to let go of. So IQOS is not an acronym. It's just a catchy name. This is the first heat tobacco, not burn tobacco instrument that exists. So you put tobacco in the in this portion, you inhale, it's been heated, and you can vary the voltage and the amount of nicotine that you get. And so there are several thousand applications in front of the FDA right now for different versions of this. And so you need legislation even to regulate inhaling nicotine that's not burned. Um, and this is a variation on the slide that you had up about influences on adolescent behavior. We could spend, I mean, there's a vast army. It once occurred to me, I went to a tobacco meeting in Prague, and there were about 3,000 what are called tobacco warriors, anti-tobacco warriors. So it occurred to me that if you ever won this fight, and like what's happening in a number of parts of the world, there is no solution. I can't picture an end. I can't picture an end to tobacco. They'll figure out some way to get it to youth. But these are the influences, and there are thousands of people who do research. And it occurred to me at that meeting that if you ever won the battle, what would happen to the careers of all these people? And it's very interesting because, again, if you wanted to create a multidisciplinary workforce on social determinants of child health, if you wanted, and you should want, and it's so difficult to do, there are so many structural impediments, there is no field of scholarly activity that doesn't have something to lend to this, whether it's economics or sociology or educational psychology or brain development or toxicology. I've spent the better part of the past 10 years with mentees and with toxicologists and biochemists. I never would have thought that that's what I would end up doing, but that's what the hookahs and the e-cigarettes led me to. So here's a picture of the first cigarette machine. Here's that picture again, but here is this. So I like to tell stories. I love words. I love narrative. I'm much more than visual. I'm auditory and words. David Kessler was a pediatrician who was the head of the FDA, who had this epiphany that the FDA was empowered, was by legislation, to regulate food and drugs, and that cigarettes were nothing more than a nicotine delivery system. And it changed the world. So that steep decline is a consequence of him having that epiphany. We can regulate this. Cigarettes are a nicotine delivery system. This is an addictive drug. There are actually 7,000 different chemicals that you inhale, and you exhale about 20,000 chemicals just a few seconds later because of metabolic changes. And secondhand smoke actually has a lot more carcinogens in it and cardiotoxins in it. It's just that the concentration in a room is not the same. I never thought that I would spend my nights in hookah bars and bars in Manhattan measuring air quality. One time I sat down on a Thursday evening to measure the air in a hookah bar in what's called the East Village, and I probably was 3 times the age of anybody else who was there. And I had all these machines to collect air. And the person I was with at around 2 a.m. got up to go to the bathroom. And I was sitting at a table next to 2 young women. And they said, "Are you a scientist? Why are you here? Are you a scientist?" And I said, "Well, I'm a pediatrician. I do a lot of science, but I never was trained in science." I said, "But I'm here collecting air." And they looked at me and they said, "You're collecting air?" I said, "Yeah, why are you here?" And they said, "It's Thursday night." And I said, "I don't get it." And they said, "We're here to hook up." And I said, "I don't know what that means." And so some people who English is their first language know what that means. It's to find somebody to have casual sex with for the weekend that you're not going to have a long-term relationship with. And my son at that time was in college. And I said, "Well, you don't need to look for somebody. He's beautiful. He has published poems. He goes to a great school. He has two older sisters, so he knows how to behave with women. He bakes. He'll read poetry that he's published, then make you dinner, and then serve you dessert. And they say, "What's his name?" So what do I know? So I actually have 3 hours of talks on social media's influence on the thumb drive that I brought in case somebody didn't come to this meeting, that I give those talks. So talk about somebody talking about something they don't know anything about. I wouldn't even know how to get onto FaceTime, not Facebook rather, um, or Instagram. But in any case, I tell them his name, and within seconds, they have a picture of my son on a Harley Davidson motorcycle showing off his six pack. And they reach out to him. So I go home and go to sleep. And at around 7 in the morning, my son calls me from college and he says, "What are you, crazy? What are you doing in a hookah bar in the East Village at 2 o'clock in the morning? Does mom know that you were there? And you don't think I could get my own women?" Teenager, like, so I said, "What am I doing in a hookah bar? How do you think we got the money to send you to that prestigious college that you go to? Mom knows about this. I was collecting air." And there's not a single medical student or public health student who has not had the same reaction in working with me the past 15 years, which is first is to be kind of taken aback at the thought that they're going to work with me to collect air. And then it sounds so weird, but then when you describe it, it's so fascinating once you get into it and working with toxicologists. If you're interested in caring for any children who suffer because of inequalities and ultimately because of choices to hurt them for financial gain of other people. So here was the person who turned me on to be a pediatrician. I was 23 years old when he was my attending as a third-year medical student. And he was, until he died a couple of years ago, I don't think there was a single month in my life that I didn't speak to this person and ask him questions about right and wrong and what was right and wrong in terms of my career. And he played that role for countless American pediatricians. So when we talk about social pediatrics, in many ways, I would think of him as the father in the United States, although I do think of Virchow as the real originator of it, a bacteriologist. So I'm telling too many stories, so I'm not going to go into the deeming rule. This gives you the legislation that grows out of the master settlement of how to regulate tobacco products. This is 2006 when this was authorized for the FDA to be able to do this. Obama held it up until 2016 because he needed the votes of southern states, senators from southern states, to pass Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. So he needed, at that point, the South was still very much a part of the United States again. It's not funny. Freud has a whole book. Freud is a dirty word now. I don't know about other medical schools around the world. I read all of Freud before I went to medical school and was a huge influence in my going to medical school. Medical students in the United States never even hear his name. And to me, he got a lot of things wrong, but a lot of the way we see the world is based on things that he found. So it's still being fought with the tobacco industry about different tobacco products. So this is a nephew of Freud, by the way, and he's the inventor of advertising. And his first client was Philip Morris and Dutch Boy white paint, which still is a major source of lead poisoning in the United States, was one of his major clients as well. And he talked about subliminal seduction, is a term that he coined, of a way of getting people to do things that you could control people through advertising. And teens are not supposed to be exposed to advertising for any form of nicotine product. 7 out of 10 report being exposed in the past month. But Edward Bernays came up with this idea that men weren't sufficient, that you could target women. So the 19th Amendment in 1919 gave women the right to vote and was enacted in 1921. And he got Philip Morris to fund a celebration of women's new freedom, that they would have parades in all the major cities of the United States showing women smoking. So this is a sign of their liberation. So if I had the slides, but we don't have the time, and showed you curves over the 20th century of deaths from lung cancer, you would see that women are about 20 years later than men, because they begin to smoke because of the targeting of women about 20 years later. But torches of freedom. So there are films, you could see them on YouTube in black and white, of these marches that go down streets. In fact, there was a polio epidemic one summer in Philadelphia that was spread as a consequence of one of these torches of freedom parades. So here is an early 20th century on your left, advertisement for a new thing called a car. And here's a 2020 car advertisement for a BMW. When you look at the BMW ad, don't you think about cars? Is that the first thing that you think about, right? So they've used the game book, and you know better than I do that if you are too strident in telling a teenager not to do something, you can actually promote the very behavior that you're trying to inhibit. And they've taken out whole page ads in magazines that kids subscribe to, or on different social media, uh, admonishing kids not to use e-cigarettes or use hookahs after they've done the studies. So there is a friend of mine, I won't tell you his name. The tobacco industry, but as a consequence of the master settlement, you're allowed to see what research they've done, but you're not allowed to take any of the studies out of their libraries, the tobacco industry's libraries. And I think he's a wonderful man. He's an impossible man, but a wonderful man who's been an anti-tobacco warrior on the West Coast for his entire career. And he took a number of his mentees to Philip Morris before there were iPhones, but with cameras, and they took pictures of all these studies that the tobacco industry had, showing that they had data going back to the 1950s, that they denied that there were any data to show that there were deleterious effects like these. And he and these students photographed thousands of pages, and they then put them together and sent them to every single faculty member of all the University of California colleges and universities, so that when the faculty woke up in the morning, they had thousands of pages of documentation that was there, and they showed up in the police station of one of the California cities and said, "We'd like to be arrested. You know, we've just stolen information about the health of the public, and we think that we'd be much more." There are many ways to change the world. I assume that all of you are here not to go to Delphi, but is it Delphi or Delphi? 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 So Philadelphia. So love of Delphi? I don't know. That's the origin of the term, you think? Silly? But these are cigarette ads. So here was Joe Camel. It took 10 years of research to show that showing this. How old do you have to be before you could tell the difference between a cartoon character and, right, right. You could recognize Joe Camel by 2 years of age, but for kids who watch cartoons, to tell that something is a cartoon versus a movie thing is more like 4 or 5. But by 2 years of age, kids in the 1990s knew Joe Camel. And I have a friend who published a study. His daughter, his oldest daughter, was the first person that my oldest daughter had a sleepover with. But he took her you know what Barbies are? My oldest daughter, at about the age of 6 or 7, took sandpaper to one of her Barbies and brought it to me and said, I told you it's hollow underneath there. She's a sociologist at this point who should be speaking at ISOP annual meetings because she's NIH funded to study those terrible people at the southern border of the United States, escaping from Colombia and Venezuela and El Salvador. Right. And I'm proud to say that my 7-year-old granddaughter goes with her mom to administer surveys to these women who leave their children behind and risk their lives. If there's anything wonderful about the United States to me, it's immigration. The hardest working, most wonderful people. During COVID, we would sneak from upstate New York to our apartment in Manhattan in the middle of the night. If for those of you who remember the first few months when we didn't know, people left their groceries outside in the rain because you didn't know if it was spread that way. And we'd sneak and we'd walk up 9 flights of stairs. And in New York City, there are 17,000 restaurants in Manhattan. So people order food in. So in the midst of this epidemic, who delivered food to middle-class people and ran up 9 flights of steps after riding a bicycle in the snow? It's hungry immigrants yearning to escape something that wasn't good and have a better life, largely for their children. So here are e-cigarettes beginning to be studied. I love this one. Let me see if we got this one. Oh, it's this one on the right. I have an old slide. I used to have a grand rounds, is what I call it, that exclusively was slides of advertisements for tobacco. And I have Ronald Reagan done up as an obstetrician, handing a baby to a mother just born in the delivery room, and he's smoking a cigarette, telling her that if she smokes Camels, the baby will grow up to be smarter. By the way, we've done a lot of work on cognition and nicotine. We haven't even begun to get to. So here's a hookah ad. I'm going to speed up. Here's an e-cigarette ad. These are current. This is if you simply Google these. So here is a picture from Slovakia at the top, a hookah bar, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Antigua Caribbean, Bob Marley, No Woman, No Cry, No Shisha, I Die. And then this is Beijing, I believe. But I went to Slovakia before the COVID and gave a talk on hookahs. And people said, what a great talk, except we don't have any problems with hookahs. You know, it's a great talk, but it has no relevance to us. And they took me out to an elegant restaurant in Bratislava for lunch, and we passed 3 hookah bars. So Carl Sagan said that we see largely what we're looking for. So once they saw hookah bars for the first time, a student wanted to do a paper with me on eating disorders in women and tanning salons. So I'm a general pediatrician. I do a lot of different things. I'm interested by lots of things, but tanning, and Trump wasn't in anybody's life yet. So I didn't even think about tanning salons or orange hair, like how you did that. But in any case, we published this paper on anorexia and tanning salons. And after doing that paper, every other corner of Manhattan has a tanning salon. I had never seen a tanning salon in my life. And now it's like any place I look, there's a pizza place downstairs and there's a tanning salon upstairs. So this is 10 years old, but this was the first paper on why adolescents reported using hookahs. Around the same time, we looked at medical students at NYU and published that paper. And then we looked at the dental students. at NYU and published that paper, and then looked at the nursing students and published that paper. And 27% of the NYU, which is now listed as the #1 medical school in the United States, over a quarter of the medical students had been in a hookah bar in the past month and used a hookah. And by the way, you have to be 21 in New York, but you're not carded, so you can go in, but you can't rent a hookah unless you buy a bottle of vodka. So all these kids are sitting and drinking vodka while they're doing the hookahs. So I'm going to go over this. All I want to show you, and we have 4 minutes. All right. We won't take it. That, by the way, for my younger colleagues here, a great trick of public speaking is go over time. Because the only time you're going to mess up is during answering the questions. So if you take up all the time, nobody can ask you a question. But there's always some irritating person when you're trying to get off stage who comes up and asks you some quasi-hostile question that you can't answer, right? But this just shows you PM 2.5 is particles that are small enough to embed in the bronchioles. So if it contains carcinogens or cardiotoxins or things that lead to inflammation, and inflammation, if we continue to do science, I don't know how long we will continue to have science with the direction that the world is going in. I live in a nation where people now question the integrity of all of you because you've devoted your lives to taking care of other people and to science. So you're not credible. Shouldn't trust authority figures. It's become the norm. And truth is just a haphazard thing. But if we continue to do research, we will find at least two things, I believe, that every disease is a gene environmental interaction. All right. So the majority of people who smoke or do e-cigarettes and vape don't get a fatal illness from it. You need to have a genetic propensity for it. And you need an exposure. And I do believe that the things that you spoke about earlier today, Donna, is an environmental exposure. Many of the alterations in family dynamics and how we dealt with children is an environmental exposure. Just quickly, we looked at hookah bar workers before and after and drew blood. It's the only time I've ever been in a gun store. All the students who collected the blood were women medical students and MPH students from NYU. And so I went to get mace spray for them. Is the only time I've been in the middle of the night. The hookah bars close. And, they're quasi-adolescents. They're very, very smart. They're very, very strong. Nobody's going to hurt me. Really, you make one mistake at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning in Manhattan, one mistake, because we moved to New York when my son was 14. And in the first week, at the end of the first week, he says, "I got it, Dad." And I said, "What do you got?" He said, "I got the city down." We had moved from a small town in upstate New York that's like from something from the 19th century. And I said, "You got the city down? What do you mean?" He said, "I memorized the train. I know all the train stations. I know how to get around." I said, "Noah, one time you mess up. One time it takes." But these young women who were very, very ardent, they thought I was being way too paternalistic. And I said, "You're going to get in a cab with a stranger at 4 o'clock in the morning and take them because our IRB insisted that the draw blood had to be on the campus. So they had to go from downtown to the medical center in the middle of the night. So I got them mace. It's the only time I've been in the presence that I know of a gun, other than in a holster and a policeman. Now, one of my children lives in Texas, in Austin, where you're allowed, and she's a tenured faculty member at the University of Texas, where you're allowed to wear a gun in a holster that's visible. So the students ever have a disgruntled student? Ever have a student who's not happy with a grade? So you have 30,000 students walking around with guns. But you could see that inflammatory markers go up. I did this study first in Dubai and then in New York City. And the basic point is that there are more carcinogens and PM 2.5 particles in a large house, in a room on a different floor at the other side of the house, than a room adjacent to a room in which somebody is smoking a cigarette. So you have many more carcinogens at the other side of the house. Is that time? Let me just see if there's anything that you must see. So one of my students takes a lot of people to make me look good. I get a lot of credit for the creativity of youth. And I think it's a great mantra for a pediatrician to trust in youth, to say that you trust in youth. So one of them says to me that she believes that walking to the train station, that people who are vaping are blowing the vape out of their nose a lot more than the people alongside them who are getting stoned, smoking joints or smoking cigarettes. So we studied inflammatory markers. See, I didn't even start to talk. We've done a lot of papers on smoking and vaping and depression. And believe it or not, there's a huge literature and people have not been able to sort out what's cause and what's effect. This is a great slide on depression and use. But here you could see smokers and vapors, the percentage who blow it out their nose. And it's people who use both. And you could see nose for smokers is 5%, and nose for vapors is 20%. But we then went and looked at inflammatory markers in the nose. And I apologize, Olivier, for something like this. But this is an amazing thing because there's only one part of your brain that it makes contact with the outside world. And that's your olfactory bulb, which is several millimeters from your mucosa, where we measured the inflammatory markers. And there's inflammation. And there's lots of data now that myocardial infarcts and depression may be diseases of inflammation, or certainly inflammation plays a major, major role in it. So a general pediatrician who just wanted to take care of poor kids in a primary care clinic ended up doing this type of stuff with people who are real doctors. That is, they're not MDs, they have PhDs, and they're real scientists, not pretend like I am. But for me, I've always seen myself as a change agent. And I do want to end with this last slide because this is I have to show this. This is the newest e-cigarette that you could you could do, you get messages, Facebook and X, formerly known as Twitter. But this is an e-cigarette. But I think of all the things that I've done, this is the thing. I'm going backwards, and I will stop. Trust me. I'm not getting to it, but I don't know why I'm not getting to it. So in 1989, I published the first paper about secondhand smoke in children and asthma. And a lot of my colleagues thought I was crazy. And it's because I was director of maternal and child health for Boston and responsible for black-white infant mortality. Half a century later, we still don't know what leads to preterm labor and how you would prevent, but I was the person responsible for it. And from that, I got to tobacco and low birth weight and preterm labor. It's not so much preterm labor as low birth weight if you smoke during pregnancy. But this is the training book. This is the book you have to go to the FDA for a week to be on their scientific advisory committee. And there aren't many pediatricians. And a lot of my pediatric friends thought that I was crazy. Lead poisoning, they could understand. But cigarettes, what does that have to do with social determinants of health and taking care of poor kids? And there's an educational gradient and an income gradient to using cigarettes. The training book now for the United States Regulatory Agency, for people who advise it, is entitled Protecting Our Kids and the Nation's Health from Tobacco. So I sat down and saw that book, and realized that it was my life's work and the work of hundreds of other pediatricians and like-minded individuals that resulted in thinking of this as a children's issue. So I could go on, I would go on. I'll end by just telling you all that I told Nick and Donna that I'll go anywhere in the world to hear myself speak. So thank you very much. It's really been an honor and a pleasure.